and virtual reality. And actually, when I talk about virtual reality, this will also resonate with just talking about games or game worlds. So it's not very specific to VR itself, although VR is a very specific kind of environment. I will talk about that. But I think a lot of the things I will say might be just true for, for playing games in general. So in that respect, you can keep that in mind. And I'll give you reasons for that are out there that are in the literature about whether or not it is that we perceive or whether or not it is what we imagine. Then I will focus on the question of imagination because I think that one is, it's not more interesting. There's different topics to be told about perception and imagination. So I will talk a little bit more about imagining. And I think that, yes, we can be imagining in VR, but the imagination that's involved is not there to represent the fiction, because I will explain earlier that I think we can perceive the fiction, whatever that means. We can directly engage with it. So if we don't need to represent fiction, then we still need imagination. And I will say yes. And this is where I bring in embodied and enactive cognitive science as a framework to give explanation of what that would mean. What else can imagination do for us? And that would be useful in this context. And finally, I'll have some response to critics. One of them would be, I'm already prefacing oh, well, how can I be a strangely embodied avatar in the game? Or how is it that I perceive glitches, which is not an active imagination? So I'll have a response to these questions, but maybe you have more questions, but I'm happy to expand on that later. So let's start a very simple question. Do we perceive or do we imagine when we're playing these games, right? Here we are virtually skiing, right? I'm seeing this mountain of snow, but you might say, well, I'm really just holding, hand holders, joysticks. And maybe, am I really perceiving pixels, but I have to imagine that these things are snow? That's one theory I'll just discuss in a second, right? What about the virtual kitten? Am I perceiving a virtual kitten, imagining it? Or when I'm playing any shooter games as well? And that's a kind of question that's been in the literature for a very long time. And to the answer of whether we imagine in VR or in games, usually the answer that's given is yes, but why? There's a very specific role for imagination to play, which is bringing to mind these fictional entities, right? The virtual kitten is not real, it's a fiction. So my mind has to do something to bring forward that I'm seeing a kitten because it's a fiction, it's not real. That's the starting point. So these are the fictionalists in the literature. That's like a Grant Tavener, for example, who has books on games, virtual reality. So that's their starting point, right? Virtual actions are fictional. They're not real, or virtual kittens. And we're only prescribed to imagine them. And so now we have to question what it is they think that we perceive. Maybe they think we're really perceiving pixels or data, so we have to do something to imagine the fiction. Here's a couple of quotes from McDonnell and Wildman. What is acted on are props that prescribe the imagining on which we only act fictionally. Or they say, and that's Robson and Meskin quoting Walton, or using Walton's philosophy, if virtual objects are fictions, they must be imagined, they say, as imagination enables engagement with fiction. That's a very broad claim. That's a very specific claim about anything at all. So it can be that I'm pretending with this bottle that it's a car. How can I possibly do it without imagining, having a mental representation of a car and acting it out, right? That's kind of the standard story. So here's more from the fictionalists, for example, Nele van de Mosselaar, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Tilburg, who writes, and I'll quote the whole thing because it's quite, I think, very clear, this quote. She says, imagine following the situation. You open a door in a video game. An in-game alert pops up with the message, congratulations, you have opened the door. Now, a new pop-up clarifies that, well, it's not really you, the player, who opened the door, but the player character. Moreover, no door was actually opened. Rather, the action took place was an input of certain commands on a controlling device. Someone moved the mouse around and clicked a button. And lastly, there was not even an actual door involved, but a group of pixels that are computer-generated digital entity is meant to evoke a door in your imagination. So the game argues, you did not really open the door, did you? She says, would it not be more precise to say that you, taking on the role of the protagonist of this game, used your cursor to interact with a virtual model and fictionally open the door that's represented to exist, right? This is you're nodding because this is a very familiar story. This is a very kind of intuitive story. I will tell you why I think it's wrong. I can even tell you right now before I go through all the slides. I'm very happy to already preface this and then kind of argue for it later and discuss it later. For me, already the problem is, because I will talk about perception and imagination, but I think this is important as a metaphysical starting point. Here, the starting point is there seems to be something like the real reality, which is pushing the button. That is real. And anything else that I do, that I interpret, is something added on. So now maybe we're part of this. We need to be able to represent something as not real, or we need to bring forward the fiction. And from the enactivist perspective and embodiment, it's already like a red flag, right? We are worried about the starting point because we don't want to say, oh, it's really a group of pixels, so now I have to do something to interpret it as a door. That would be analogous to saying, well, maybe you're really a bunch of tissues or cells, and now I interpret you as a professor or as a person, human being. Or are my words real? Or is it just hot air spewing from my mouth and then, air vibrations getting to your ear? Is that real? So what they're doing, in our view, is already assuming there's a certain kind of physical reality that's more basic. And then when you do some interpretation of it, it's an added thing. And now I just want to preface that from an activist and embodied cognition starting point, that's already a kind of a category mistake. It's kind of like a dualism we don't want, because from embodied and active cognitive science, and I will explain later, all our interactions are they're already interpreted, they're already meaningful, right? You cannot separate, you cannot say that pushing the button is more real than an action that I'm doing, like typing on a computer, because that's already enculturated action. So I will argue and talk more about that, but this is kind of one of the reasons why we're a little bit concerned with the fictionalist starting point. But with that starting point, what notion of imagination is at play? Well, then they cash out imagination as your representational activity that's used to arrive at certain beliefs and counterfactuals, like that the kitten is here, right? Even though it's not there really. So imagination is also said to be needed in order to account for having these controlled experiences in the absence of appropriate stimuli, right? And then assumption about the perception is that, well, you really perceive the reality of it, which is something like the pixels, and you have to do some interpretive cognitive work, right? And then if we, I'm not going to delve too much into this because in philosophy of imagination, there's different notions of imagination. So I had to spell out, what are we talking about? Imagistic imagination or propositional? Imagistic would be like having mental imagery or mental states that are image-like, sensory-like, quasi-perceptual. As, for example, Benson-Anay says, or Pearson, these are representations of sensory information without direct external stimulus. That's usually what they mean by something being a mental image. Well, I think that notion of imagination is quite questionable, whether we are producing these mental images when we engage with virtual objects, because clearly there is a very special sensory input received from the game interfaces, especially in the case of VR, from various screens and headsets. They cover our eyes, we are getting stimulus. So it's not that in the absence of stimulus, you have to create mental image. So I think we're talking about, or they're talking about propositional imagination. So we have a direct quote that would indicate that. For example, MacDonald and Wildman say that as a world fiction, games feature principles of generation, such as, imagine that this projected image of a large green ogre-looking thing is a fully three-dimensional entity. Or, if X appears in the window in the bottom right, then imagine that this ogre thing uttered a relevant sentence out loud. As if these are sort of like these commands of how you're supposed to be imagining. So it's much more propositional. So what would be the alternative then? Alternative right now in the literature is to not talk about imagination at all, which I also think is a mistake, but that's what's happening. So either we have this imagination is there to represent fictions in a propositional or imagistic way, though I'm not sure imagistic works. Then we have the realists who say, well, actually, no, maybe you don't need to imagine anything because you're not engaging with fictional objects, especially in VR, but with real computer-generated objects. And I think Jesper Juhl maybe would be in the same camp, right? With the realists, with Chalmers and Sagan. And there's different variations of realism, but I just kind of put them together for argument's sake. So they would say virtual objects or the given representations can be directly perceived somehow in the VR. But this is also a little bit too simple because if we kind of analyze their commitments, not what they say, but what they have to say, what their commitments are, then I think imagination could be used on their proposal too, to represent what is happening in a fiction so that what is true in the fiction can be distinguished from what's happening in the reality. And Chalmers in his 2017 paper, before the book came out, he talked about this dualistic view about virtual and game worlds that would concede that the digital world might be what users interact with, but insist that it is the fictional worlds that they still perceptually represent. We can still have both. You could still have the role of that, the imagination we talked about in the realist picture. So in VR, one could perceptually represent something else than what is perceived, and he compares it to something like having an illusion. But I will move on to the question for a second of whether we perceive in VR. And actually, there's a whole alternative out there that I also contributed to with my colleagues, where we start with ecological psychology and James Gibson's notion of perception. And this paper that's already published from last year with Ed Baggs and Pavel Grabarczyk, he's a game philosopher in the game center, but Ed Baggs is a philosopher of cognitive science and ecological psychology. And the paper started with, well, what would Gibson say if he was still around about what it is that we perceive when we are in VR? And the idea here is that we can argue that there is very much visual information that's available in virtual reality that we could directly perceive. But we're not taking the Marr kind of starting point of what perception is that need to be represented, but ecological psychology. So we write in that paper that an accurate understanding of perceptual information available in VR may contribute to philosophical debates around the nature of virtual reality. And we ask 3 questions in that paper. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but the one that's kind of relevant, which is the first one for this talk. Is virtual reality a kind of picture perception to begin with? Because Grant Avedon says it's like a picture. They're taking the debate from philosophy of art and aesthetics, right? There's no paintings here. I wish there was a picture. Let us draw something. But so imagine there's a painting here of a boat. And this is a very old debate, right? Do I really see colors and shapes and I represent it as a boat? That's the starting point of seeing pictures. And that's kind of, that debate has been just slapped onto virtual reality. And we think that's not quite right because in VR, are we perceiving pictures? Well, maybe if I'm put on a headset and I'm in a virtual museum, I'm going to be perceiving virtual pictures, sure. But is what I'm presented a picture, like a picture? And we actually argue, no. So we think that virtual reality headset is better understood not as image-based display, and you can correct us, but this is what we think is right. But a pair of electronic spectacles that allow the wearer to sample a simulated ambient optic array, which is the Gibsonian notion of like how perception in the real world works. So a given piece of virtual reality technology may happen to use picture screens, sure, but what virtual reality device really does, it makes available this array of optical information that the user's visual system can explore as we're moving the headset around and as we're just getting the simulated ambient optic array. So here, if we just understand a little bit of what ecological take to perception is, they say that perception occurs when organism performs actions, right? Perception is for action. And humans are typically able to discriminate the distance between objects and their point of view by moving. So that is, we generate this optic flow through motion parallax that allows us to directly discriminate between what's closer or what is further away from us, which is very similar to an activist view of perception as well, as found in Oregon and Norway, for example, the sensory motor account of perception. That perception is conceived by enactive theories, also contains active path in which the subject constantly probes the environment. So this is one starting point of how perception in general works, right? It's not just passive reception of data, right? It's active doing something. You might disagree with this whole picture of perception, but if that's right, then we want to point to the fact that this is what's happening in VR. And this is just clarification of the terms again. The ambient optic array is the structured arrangement of light with respect to point of observation, and the invariants are stable features of the environment. They remain constant, even if there's changes in viewing conditions. So what Gibson said, he actually said something about perceiving pictures themselves. And the optic array that the picture presents is not ambient, because picture only contains information that was put there when the picture was created. Nothing can be changed about it. So it's a very static visual perception. What's happening when we're looking at the picture is a really special case of natural vision. That's not how we typically see things, because we learn to pick up invariants typically by moving around, which is exactly what you can do actually in a VR. So virtual reality environments work then in a different set of principles than pictures, we argue. It is much more like perception in the world and not picture perception. So what's being modeled is not internal dynamics of the nervous system, but the external dynamics of the information arrays. And to build a VR system, it really might be necessary to build an ambient optic array because the user moves around in that virtual space. That's one of the arguments in that paper for why we're talking about. And then, so this is trying to understand the technology through the lens of ecological take to perception, which is, in line with embodied and active cognition. And in some sense, we just argue in that paper that you're not perceiving images, pictures, what you can actually directly perceive the information, right? And now you can ask me later in the Q&A, can I perceive information about the dragon because dragon is not real? Well, in some sense, dragon is not real, but in the information I get about the dragon is directly available to me in perception, even though, of course, dragon doesn't have the materiality. I won't be able to walk through that dragon. There's different levels of information that we're talking about. But to get back to the point of what we perceive in VR or we imagine, here's like independent kind of argument for why we can say that we directly perceive these virtual entities, and then we can talk more about what it means that they are fictions, right? That's a very interesting topic. So then to this question, do we perceive or do we imagine in VR? My answer is going to be it's both, right? We both perceive and imagine in VR, because point one is from ecological psychology, arguing that you can directly perceive virtual dragons, but that doesn't mean you don't need to imagine anything at all anymore. So I think it's a mistake to say, because now I don't need imagination to represent fictions, imagination is not involved. So I don't want to say that either. So now I want to bring in what other roles imagination typically plays. Why is imagination not needed to represent fiction? Because it can still play a specific role in our experience of virtual entities. And it's involved in two things. This is what I argue in this paper. You're anticipating virtual possibilities for action or virtual affordances. And I want to say that's kind of an imaginative act, even though maybe Gibson himself would say seeing affordances is always a perceptual capacity. That's why I'm not a Gibsonian. I'm an activist. So I'm like borrowing what I need to kind of create a more coherent theory in my view. And then you are allowing one to be creative within the virtual game context. I think if we take seriously that you can still, what it would mean to be imaginative and kind of create spaces for imagination, that's not just to represent the fictional world. We can make certain games or environments that are virtual more creative. And then I'm happy to have that discussion. How am I doing with time? I'm taking like very long time to just introduce these, but okay, we're halfway. Good. So that would require a different account of imagination to make these points. So now I'll turn to part 2, which is this embodied and active account of imagination. Is there any questions right now, or clarification for now? Okay. It was like a stage setting into talking about this, like why would this be even important or on the table, right? Okay, what's embodied embodied imagination and active imagination? Well, in some trivial sense, although it gets more deeper and complicated, the idea here is that really imagining is going to be dependent on our body and the kind of bodies we have. Here's a quote that I like from Jones and Skonen that I think is quite interesting. They say, we cannot imagine something being both red and green all over, which might indicate that such situation is impossible. Very often people say, this is logically impossible, right? It's just impossible situation. But they say, however, that could equally be a result of our limited embodied perspective. A creature with 2 visual systems might think otherwise. So what we think are logical impossibilities are just from our embodied sort of perspectives. Again, like there's certain things we could be perceiving or imagining that are just really connected with how our bodies are, how our eyes are shaped in our heads, and how it is that we can interact with the environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. An active imagination is the idea that imagination is something we do, we enact. It's never passive. It's never just happening in our brains, although our brains are also active organs, they do stuff. But here we want to say that imagining can be very much integrated with perception and action in this ongoing dynamical pattern, because it's a construction that involves motoric processes, which are habitually informed by perception, and thereby it's not reducible to simply having an image. I'll give some examples later. But here's one from Jose Medina's an activist view of imagination from 2013. He says, imagining a room, for example, like, for example, where you will put the baby crib because the baby is coming, right? It's not, he says, it's enacting and reenacting, seeing that room, moving eyes around, checking things out, right? Not just having some sort of static mental model of it. There's sort of activity going on always, sensory motor, and involves kind of motion that allows us to create that kind of image. It doesn't mean you cannot ever close your eyes and have a static image. These are very specific cases. Typically, imagination will be kind of enacted. And in another paper with Sean Gallagher, we wrote how imagination is quite constrained by strong embodiment. And here we refer to the role that extraneural body plays in cognition, such as your rooted embodiment, so the kind of embodied motoric processes that operate in the current action, and your history of bodily interactions that make up your habit. In some sense, you cannot imagine anything you want. You are kind of constrained by what you have perceived, the culture you are in, how you've been enculturated. All these things affect your imaginative processes. Also, explicit embodiment, so bodily postures, perception, movement, body-environment coupling will also shape how it is that you imagine, if not what. And we contrast that to something like weak embodied cognition, because it exists as well in the literature. Some people talk about embodied cognition, like Frédéric de Vignemont, for example, or Alvin Goldman, but they really just mean body formatted representation. So it's still a representational system in your mind that does everything kind of offline and is just about the body. But that's not what we mean. We want to kind of take the body, the movement much more seriously into the picture, into the dynamics of how imagining occurs. So in our view, there's kind of three time scales that come together, the past, the present, and future. The past would be that we are rooted in our sensory motor activation, like rehearsal or neural reuse hypothesis can be used by Anderson to talk about how it is we imagine the actual bodily motions where sensory motor processes are unfolding, and anticipating actions or prospecting. So for example, if you're imagining, like right now, the clock was doing king kong, kang kong, kang. And you can anticipate what's going to happen, right? That's like prospecting. You're hearing a sequence of tones because of your kind of embodied habituation to what you can anticipate. It's not just like some purely, on not embodied activity. So here the outcome is that imaginings are going to be recreative perceptions because in imagination, we reuse the perceptual motor system in the act of anticipating or prospecting future actions. And we argue that even having a visualization, even what sometimes it's called like sitting, static visualization is very much embodied too. So we don't want to say, oh, it's always every time you're moving around or doing something, and the moment you sit still, you can't imagine. No, of course you can. That's still embodied too. I won't argue for it too much, but this is just that we can address this aspect too. And the example would be, this is Alex Honnold. He's a free soloist. Do you know what free solo is? They're climbing a rock without any harness, and they're not connected to anything. So most people think they're crazy, right? And for them, they're just like, oh, it's like a skill. Like, you know how to drive a car, then you know how to do it. Sure, you can get in an accident, but so he has that skill, for example. It takes special kind of person, I think, still to be able to do that. But there's a lot of preparation goes into free soloing, like in any sport. But there's a lot of mental rehearsal and mental training too. That's fascinating. So when he's free soloing, before he was doing that, he would explain he was visualizing every single move, everything that could possibly happen, every handhold and foothold on the long way to the top wall. So not only he climbed that rock with the harness and the ropes, I don't know how many times. So he was very comfortable and memorized the rock. But every condition is going to be different, right? In wind or rain. He was then sitting and visualizing it. And for us, it's very clear from our embodied perspective that the other body as kind of content that you can represent anything you want in imagination view can't capture. Because if you could represent anything you want, I can do that. And it wouldn't be part of my training. I can visualize that I'm Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, and climb, and I will fall to my death, right? It's not going to be training. So why does this work as training? Because we want to say imagining here is actively reenacting the movements in imagery. And it already involves habitually acquired cross-modal motoric and peripheral processes. Processes connected to action-oriented vision, body posture, tactile sensory stimulation. That's like a case in point of why even visualizing here, sitting still and visualizing requires all these aspects. So it's very similar to what Sartre would say, that image is not a thing in the head. Phenomenologists say that already. These are neuroscientists who all agree that motor imagery is a process, not a kind of a picture or thing in your head as well. So this is where neuroscientists agree with us too. So again, to kind of summarize, strongly embodied imagination means that there's explicit movements that can infuse our imaginings and bring forth new imaginative experiences. Because movement allows us to engage in these forms of imagining, it allows us to imagine situations that were unimaginable before. For example, how a mathematical equation adds up, right? Being able to physically like move with your hands. It's much more introduced in the States now when they're doing math. Finally, to be able to, for children to be able to move things around, like to understand ratios, 1 to 3, with their hands, and they immediately get kind of like a better idea. Or how planets or meteors move through space, that they can actually somehow play and represent that with their bodies. So in these contexts, imaginings are really actively shaped by use of artifacts, props, and engagement with other people that leads to jointly discovering, creating new possibilities for action. this is all very long and technical, maybe about imagination, but this is where virtual reality and games will be very relevant in a second, because embodied imagination and active imagination, this is how we think imagination works. Game spaces, VR spaces actually offer great context in which we can even be more imaginative, train our imagination. So in that sense, we should be using that for those purposes and not just worry whether or not we're really seeing the dragon because it's a fiction or not. I'm worried that the debate has focused so much on deciding if it's a fiction or not that they're forgetting that there's this whole potential of games and VR to be able to kind of broaden our notions of imagination. And similarly, enactive and accounts of imagination, focus on imagination being action-oriented, deeply tied to acting in the world. It's an interactive process of exploring our environment, which we can do in virtual reality settings as well. And imagination will be influenced and constrained by the available affordances that the environment provides. Good. Is embodied enactive imagination or theory even applicable to VR? If anybody sometimes questioned that, I say yes as a starting point, because I don't think we are brains in a vat that play VR. This is just a comment on something like someone like David Chalmers, who spent a lot of time in his book Reality Plus, wondering about the possibility of VR being a perfect simulation. So like a matrix, like you are. I'm not interested in that possibility at all. I'm interested in the person who's putting on a headset and what it is that they perceive and what it is that they do to be able to imagine in it. So I think we just want to focus on that and not get strained by different kind of metaphysical, philosophical issues. So to apply to VR, this idea of embodied and active imagination, I think imagination is still relevant for virtual interactions in two ways. Because it is in an embodied way, because we will see imagination as rooted in these activations that play a role in helping us anticipate virtual game affordances. I'll explain that in a second. And an active way which sees imagination as shaped by interacting and contexts and relationships found in the game that will foster creativity. So I'll explain these 2 points now briefly. What does it mean to anticipate virtual affordances? What are virtual affordances? Are just affordances in a virtual reality or in a game that the game affords. They're not special kinds of affordances. They're just what it is that you can do within the constraints of the game. And virtual reality involves these persistent and rich sources of affordances. And game environments form affordance spaces on which we genuinely act. So a virtual affordance is just going to be activities that you can do in a virtual reality or in a game. And they can be directly perceived. Already, Rolla argued that they need not to be imagined or make-believed. If somebody asks if there even are affordances in virtual reality, I will say yes. Of course, there are going to be limitations on what the environment can provide, right? Let's say you're playing Beat Saber, and it's very clear what the affordances are in terms of smashing the block in half, and there's not many more affordances. But if you have virtual environments they can explore and play with, or trying to see, like Jesper Juhl writes about whether or not you can walk over to the block, walk through it, touch it, bring it forth, there's much more degrees of freedom in those environments. So there's always going to be some affordances, more or less. And there can be affordances for exploratory actions, such as I just explained. You can you have the freedom to seek new information in this world. So you can look behind the virtual wall or experiencing back of the wall without there being any wall in the traditional sense when you're in a VR game. And for performatory action, like slashing of the virtual blocks or flying virtual dragons, whatever is kind of prescribed in the game. These are all very much philosophical questions again, because I'm already responding to all these critics, but like, oh, but how can you see affordances if they're not there? This is again back to the fictionalist, like, well, the dragon's not there, I have to imagine it. The affordance is not there because it's a fiction. Now I'm like, no, this is again your starting point I don't endorse, right? because the fictionalists say that fictional entities cannot be really acted upon, and they're just props that prescribe our imagination. And my response is that virtual affordances are relations that come out in the context of play, because I'm really doing something. I have a hand controller, and when I'm virtually swimming, I'm literally doing something. It's a real action of virtual swimming. It looks maybe right now like this. It's not very sophisticated, but it is constitutively the same action. It's not like this is a real action and there's some second digital action going on there, or that this is not a real action and there's no action going on there. We want to say it's a constitutive relation. It's exactly the same thing, and there's two aspects, right, of this action. If somebody asks me within the game world, what am I doing? I'm like, well, I'm virtually swimming. I'm trying to get to this treasure maybe at the bottom of the ocean. But if I go to the doctor's office the next day and they're asking me what I've been doing all day, right? I'm not saying I was swimming, virtually swimming. I will say, well, I was making this motion. That's why I have a hand cramp and my elbows hurt. So in a different context, you focus on different aspects of the same action. And here, so when we have affordances in this game world, we want to say it's this, you're really acting, and this is just what virtually swimming looks like. You have virtual affordances there that are relations for you, and you can actually perceive them. So virtual environment affords virtual interactions to us in relation to the capacities we have in the game or the capacities that the avatar has. And arguably, you can perceive relations, right? I can perceive what it is I can do. I sit on the chair, right, before I kind of go and sit on it. So this dragon is perceived as pliable, or block as smashable, zombie as killable, really dependent on the possibilities that the game space allows, but also your needs. I want to say that the information about the dragon is there, but the affordances are relational in terms of what you bring, what you need. So the same way you would see the affordance of drinking from your bottle, but not from mine, because that's kind of not culturally, I don't know, elegant thing to do. Or you can sit on this chair, but you wouldn't sit on this chair. In the game context too, you might see that you are asked or required to maybe kill a dragon or kill a bunch of puppies. There are these games now that are trying to make you think whether or not you should be really engaging in these activities because they're unethical. That's very fascinating, right? They're trying to make you think, oh, well, I have to kill all these puppies to level up. It's part of the game, so I have to do it. As opposed to, wait, let's stop and think, right? Is quitting something that I can actually, right? It's kind of afforded in the game. Should I stop because it's unethical? So these are sort of affordances. Do I want to run away from the dragon? Do I want to slay the dragon? These are possibilities for action that still depend on your engagement. So they're not affordances, I would never say, are created by the designers of the game. You have certain constraints and information, but affordance is something relational. So the possibilities are experienced within this context. And what does it mean to anticipate them? It's to anticipate how an action might unfold in the VR. So you might not necessarily see all the possibilities yet, but you're anticipating what can happen. And that's an imaginative activity. So to perceive a chair as sitonable maybe is not to imaginatively perceive that you are sitting on it. So some counterfactual state of affairs, but it is to perceive what you can do at some moment in time. And this anticipation can be seen as a kind of imaginative prospective act because the anticipated action is not yet there. It does not mean that the affordance for it is not there or needs to be imagined, because not all virtual affordances or affordances in general are always perceptually given. Often they must be discovered or uncovered or maybe inferred in a game. And since affordances are relations also hold now, not in the future. So a relation can be present and can be perceived, even though the action still needs to be anticipated and performed in the future. Here is a good example of something of like, I like climbing examples as well, because I like climbing. So here's another example of a climber perceiving nested affordances. So an expert will look at the wall differently than novice. Novice just sees, oh, where can I immediately grab on and pull myself, as opposed to expert just looks at where can I rest? How can I do this route most quickly, most efficiently? And of course, once you're actually hanging on that wall, you will, again, a whole new affordances might open up for you, right? Maybe you have tried it 3 times. Now you're tired. Your body is, pulling it down, weighing it down. And you might think, okay, now you're perceiving, again, the environment differently. So kind of nested affordances would be the idea that there are genuine affordances that you can find in the game, and they will show up as sequences of possibilities per action that unfolds as you are engaging in your spatial-temporal activity. So there again, they're not special kinds of imaginative things or fictitious kinds. They're not fiction, right? This is just part of our being able to perceive a relation that can hold in the future, because we need to look at cognition and the dynamics that are always unfolding, right, in time. So of course, sophisticated VR users will learn to exploit and master these virtual affordances, and they can help them train new skills in the game. Once you become an expert, you level up, you start seeing new possibilities and new challenges. And that happens with game players too, of course. Some might worry, well, what about something like a false affordance? Like you can maybe open an in-game door that cannot actually be opened. That's actually Israel would challenge me on that, saying, well, because they're there, they're clearly, then I must be imagining something that's not there. Or fireability of cannons that cannot be fired. Sure, I will say these are just situations that there are no actual virtual affordances available to be explored. Now you have actually found a simulation of affordance. Precisely, this is the moment you have a representation of something. Not that everything else was a representation all along. So like at Trump oil paintings, right? They're making you kind of perceive something that's not there. And also false affordances are not going to be special to virtual worlds, because a door in a mall that looks openable might not be openable. You don't know until you actually try. So it just did not have that affordance. So I don't think it's a big problem, let's say. Then there's the last, then what else imagination can do for us in game context and in VR is fostering creativity. And I think that's the one that's most interesting. Am I doing? I'm almost done. So I'll just check, because I was given 45 minutes. Oh, I was given kindly so much time. I'm like trying to take you on a journey, but I have maybe like 5-7 more minutes. So what does it mean to foster creativity? So there is a certain role the imagination play, that's a performative role. They're connected, of course, to the first one. It's a little bit of a different focus. So here, the idea is that we can find affordances in dynamic interaction between the agent with environment, which changes with movement and novel interactions with other people. And that can afford creative ways of acting. And I think that's what should be explored more. So in game context, as I said, information about the game object is already present and ready to be explored. But what affordances you actually experience, just on a level of experience we can talk. Whether or not dragon affords slaying or running away from, that shows up for your first person perspective once the gamer actually plays the game. And then one of the critics I would get is, what about glitches? How is it possible, on my view, that I can say something like, I can see a glitch, right? Here's, for example, the game character that can apparently mount this force still, even though it's flying in the sky, but the character doesn't see it as flying. It's clearly a glitch in the game. So we can see it, but it doesn't disrupt the game too much. And maybe in the other case, she actually walks through the wall, so it's kind of disrupting the game. So this is where the fictionalist kind of strikes back, like the Empire strikes back again, and they say, well, how else can I explain that this is not real perception, other than by invoking this representational notion of imagination? Because they will say here that the gamer is not seeing what the virtual world prescribes anymore. It's a disruption of this representational seeing as capacity. To that, we have an answer as well, or I do, that I would just say there's a glitch, right? It created an environmental situation where one is not able to perceptually explore the environment in a typical way anymore. Something different happened that you were not paying attention to that's still part of the same world. Kind of like walking and talking. Like we can have a coffee afterwards, walk and talk about this lecture, and then you trip. And now you're focusing on this on the reality of it, let's say, of the environment where there was a stone and you're not paying attention to that before. So here the glitch is the same thing, we want to say. It just disturbed your grip of the situation, further disrupting relevant kind of interactions that are afforded in the game. So you're brought out of this maybe game context for a second. And you can have different ways of attuning to glitches because you can perceive the glitch and now continue to perceive the virtual environment as having these virtual walls without one of them being an act of imagination necessarily. It's kind of like double attunement. It's different aspects seeing. So now I just paid attention to this digital reality of the game, right? It brought me out of maybe the game, but sometimes some people now start seeking out glitches intentionally as part of the game, so they have actually embraced it. Some people who test games only pay attention to, right, how fast, and they're not paying attention to the narrative aspect of the game. So it's kind of like there's just different aspects, but there's not two worlds, real and not real, and one real one being perceived and the not real one being imagined. So we want to stay away from that. What about something like, how can I embody a strangely embodied avatar? I just talked about how important it is that your imaginative capacities and even perceptual ones are relying on your skills, your embodied motoric habituation. How can I possibly play being a red ball or an octopus with 8 arms? And the question is here, if our capacities for imagination in a virtual game are dependent on our actual bodies, how can we see possibilities for game action as a giant red ball, for example? And here it's a very kind of trivial answer because the game, of course, allows for the use of my learned embodied habits and for perception. So we can still see its affordances as relevant to us. So even strangely embodied avatars are designed in such a way as for us to enable control of them that is modeled on exactly what it is that our bodies can do. And we just incorporate into our bodily repertoires various tools that do not resemble biological bodies. That's a case for like extended mind. Like the first time that kind of controller came out, there's very funny interviews with people from, I don't know if it was maybe 70s or early 80s, that kind of joysticks. These are common now. Everybody knows what to do with these. When they first came out, the users were like, what? I pushed this button up and down to move the head of the gamer, and this one is camera, and this one's movement. This is so counterfactual. So it's just like having a tool, like literally a prosthetic arm. You have learned to incorporate technology in a specific way, and it's just part of your now extended sensory motor system. So of course I can be a giant red ball and an octopus because I don't have to have had 8 arms to be able to control that kind of a character. So we still can make a case for it being very much embodied and connected to what our bodies, how they are, and we just learn new skills. So now to conclude, do we perceive or imagine in VR? That was the question at the start of this talk, and I try to argue that it is very much both, and they're not in juxtaposition with each other. And I think that the embodied and active imagination as a concept is useful here because it proposes there's a relational aspect and not just representational aspect for imagination to play in engaging with VR. Because this shift has focused from something like generating mental images or models or propositions about the fiction that I'm engaging with, to something like this dynamic interplay between the individual and the virtual environments that you have inhabited. And then the social world I didn't talk about social aspect, but it will come in here as well. So that will allow us to foster a possibility of anticipating affordances and maybe fostering creativity. Why would that be attractive as a view? And I'm just gonna end on this soon, that we can consider now how it is that we can pretend or be imaginative in VR. And nobody really asked that question. I think it's fascinating. Maybe actually it's very obvious in the game center, right? How does that I can be imaginative when I play, as opposed to, oh, I'm already imagining because it's a fiction. No, boring. I don't want to talk about that anymore. So I'm trying to take that off the table and open up the space to talking about how does that can actually maybe like pretend play in VR, right? Of course, it might not be like pretend playing in non-virtual environments because it's a different type of social interaction and I have to get attuned to this environment. There might be a different way of exploring the objects because they don't have materiality. And current games are not designed in a way to allow playful exploration so much. They're very much goal-directed so far, but we can create different kinds of games and environments. But now, at least we can think about how we can focus on opening up new virtual affordances, which I think is especially interesting for VR being used in rehabilitation and like mental health right now, because there's a lot of VR treatment for like depression, for different kinds of activity, and mental disorders that one might have. And they're just modeling, I was telling you before, they're modeling existing therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy. They're not thinking about how I can use this space to create like a playful environment for a person to talk to their depression and draw it and maybe do something with it, something that can be much more creative and exploratory if we allow those spaces to play that role. But at least we have these reasons, and not that pretense requires representing absence or dealing with fiction. So we're getting always, at least the philosophy, that discussion always gets kind of off to the wrong tracks. So as I said, enactive imagination might allow for pretend play to be possible. Maybe who would actually pretend with the Beat Saber stick that it's a walking stick? Nobody thinks to do that because it's not kind of interesting maybe in the game. But we could create spaces where you are invited to do something new. So that will be dependent on like relaxing task constraints, maybe playing with others and seeing how different social kind of affordances can emerge in games as well. So I think that would be very useful for all sorts of the new kind of technology that's out there right now. And we have started exploring this topic last year in Antwerp, where we had a conference called Playing in VR, and it was exactly about how it is that we can play in VR and do something fun in it. So thank you now for your attention. And there's more details in this paper. Thank you.